It's July 6th, and there is a lot to get through today because the situation in and around Iran has genuinely spiraled in the last 72 hours. Anti-aircraft activity has reportedly been picked up over parts of Iran during an enormous days-long funeral for the country's slain supreme leader. On top of that, there is horrific confirmed news that a U.S. Navy sailor has been lost after a helicopter crash in the Arabian Sea. And layered on top of both of those stories, crowds at that same funeral have been publicly calling for the assassination of the sitting president of the United States. This is a lot to sit with. Let's go through it carefully, piece by piece. Start with the funeral itself, because it's the backdrop everything else is playing out against. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed back on February 28th in the opening minutes of the war, alongside members of his own family in a joint American and Israeli strike. It has taken more than 4 months to actually bury him. His body has been lying in state at the massive Imam Khomeini Masala complex in Tehran since July 3rd, with authorities expecting what could ultimately be millions of mourners over the course of the week. On Monday, his casket is scheduled to move through the streets of Tehran, then cross into Iraq to pass through the Shia holy cities of Najaf and Karbala, before finally returning to Iran for burial at the Imam Reza Shrine in Mashhad, his birthplace, later this week. This is not a quiet, private burial. This is one of the largest coordinated logistical and political spectacles the Islamic Republic has staged in years, deliberately built to project unity and defiance to a population that has spent months absorbing military humiliation and economic collapse. And in the middle of that spectacle, there have been reports of anti-aircraft fire over parts of Iran, including around Tehran during the funeral proceedings. What exactly was being shot at has not been officially confirmed. It's worth being honest about that uncertainty rather than pretending otherwise. But context matters here. Iran scrambled fighter jets for combat air patrols over the funeral on multiple days this week, a fairly clear signal that Iranian Air Defense Command was treating the airspace above millions of its own mourners as a live threat environment, not a ceremonial one. The most plausible explanation floating around is that Iranian air defenses were reacting to surveillance drones, possibly Israeli, possibly American, monitoring exactly who showed up to pay respects and tracking movements as officials departed afterward. Whether that's confirmed or not, the fact that Iran felt the need to keep fighter jets on standby over its own supreme leader's funeral tells you everything about how seriously Tehran is taking the possibility of another strike, even during a period the regime itself declared sacred. That fear is not paranoia without cause. Iran's own new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, has still not appeared publicly at his own father's funeral, more than 4 months after taking the position. Reporting indicates he was wounded in the same strike that killed his father, reportedly suffering facial injuries and damage to one or both legs, and that Iranian security officials have specifically rejected his requests to attend burial events out of fear that Israel could target him if he shows himself. 3 of Khamenei's other sons did appear publicly this week, alongside senior officials, including Revolutionary Guard Commander Ahmad Vahidi and Quds Force Commander Esmail Khani, in what was described as their first major public appearance since the war began. But the man actually holding the title of Supreme Leader remains completely out of view. Roughly 20 messages have reportedly been attributed to him since his succession, and by multiple accounts, they have done little to convince ordinary Iranians that he is genuinely exercising power at all. When the person supposedly running your country won't show his face at his own father's funeral, that is not a minor optics problem. That is a leadership vacuum playing out in front of the entire world. Now here's where this funeral stopped being just a domestic Iranian story and became something the rest of the world had to sit up and pay attention to. During the ceremony, a poet serving as master of ceremonies stood in front of a crowd of hundreds of thousands of people and openly called for the assassination of the President of the United States. He asked the crowd why the man who killed his imam should still be alive and said it would be a disgrace not to kill Trump. The crowd cheered. He led chants of death to America and death to Israel, and the phrase, "Trump's killing is our duty," was used directly in his remarks. Posters and banners explicitly calling for Trump's and Netanyahu's deaths were visible throughout the ceremony grounds. Iranian officials didn't exactly rush to distance themselves from it either. A senior figure, Mohammad Mokber, stated publicly that the killers of the martyred imam will not die a natural death, language that reads less like grief and more like a promise. Hardline Iranian newspapers ran front pages this week with headlines like "Blood for Blood," explicitly demanding that those responsible for Khamenei's death be personally targeted. This is, by any reasonable definition, a foreign government's officially staged national event, turning into a platform for open incitement against a sitting American president, broadcast to the world. On the same day, Trump himself was speaking in Washington, marking the 250th anniversary of the country's founding. Trump reportedly told reporters he was following the funeral and suggested Iranian officials gathered there could theoretically be targeted, but said Washington wouldn't act on that specifically because it still needs people on the other side of the table to negotiate with. That is a remarkably restrained response to a public call for your own assassination. And it tells you something important about how much Washington still wants these negotiations to hold together, even now. Now let's talk about the loss that deserves real solemnity here, because underneath all of the geopolitical maneuvering, a real person is gone. On July 1st, at around 3:30 in the morning Eastern Time, an MH-60S Seahawk helicopter assigned to the aircraft carrier USS George H.W. Bush made an emergency water landing in the Arabian Sea. There were 4 crew members aboard. 3 were recovered quickly and remained in stable condition on the carrier. 1 did not come home. For more than 102 hours, U.S. Navy and Air Force assets, including aircraft from 2 separate carrier air wings, helicopter squadrons from 2 carriers, P-8 Poseidon patrol squadrons, and additional Air Force assets, searched more than 14,000 square miles of open water looking for that missing sailor. On July 5th, the Navy formally suspended the active search. The sailor, assigned to Helicopter Sea Combat Squadron 5, has not been publicly identified while the Navy completes next of kin notification. Officials have stated there is no indication the crash was caused by hostile action, and the actual cause remains under investigation. Whatever ultimately explains this crash, a family somewhere is receiving the worst possible news right now, in the middle of an already tense and volatile deployment. That loss deserves to be acknowledged on its own terms, separate from every geopolitical angle wrapped around it. It's also worth noting this wasn't an isolated mechanical incident in a vacuum. Earlier in the war, back in June, a U.S. Army Apache helicopter crew had to be rescued from the Gulf of Oman after Trump stated Iranian forces had downed the aircraft. This is now the second time in a matter of weeks that American helicopter crews operating in these waters have needed rescue, in a region where the line between routine mechanical failure and hostile action is not always immediately clear, and where every incident inevitably gets read through the lens of an active, technically paused, but not actually over war. Meanwhile, other flashpoints kept firing throughout the same window. A cargo vessel issued a distress alert after coming under attack by unknown armed assailants roughly 30 nautical miles southwest of Hudaida, Yemen, according to the UK Maritime Trade Operations Agency. Authorities are still investigating, but the pattern lines up with the ongoing campaign of Houthi harassment against shipping in the Red Sea corridor, a separate but connected front in this broader regional mess that never fully went away, even while the world's attention was locked onto Hormuz and the funeral in Tehran. Speaking of Hormuz, the maritime picture there remains genuinely strange. Commercial shipping data over the past several days shows that the overwhelming majority of vessel traffic through the strait continues to use Iran's own designated route, rather than the alternative corridor through Omani waters that the U.S. and its partners have been trying to establish. Some ships have attempted the Omani route and then reversed course mid-transit, apparently deciding it wasn't worth the risk, while other groups abandoned that corridor entirely and crossed back into Iranian-controlled waters instead. Britain and France have stated that Oman has committed to working with them to secure safe navigation through its own territorial waters, but the actual on-the-water behavior of commercial shippers tells a different story right now. When the ships carrying the world's oil consistently choose to sail through this route controlled by the country that spent the last several months blowing up tankers, rather than the route backed by the U.S. Navy, that is the market quietly telling you exactly who it believes actually controls that waterway day to day, regardless of what any diplomatic framework says on paper. Iran's own rhetoric around Hormuz hasn't softened either. Iran's deputy foreign minister reiterated this week that any effort to establish separate or alternative shipping arrangements through the strait, meaning arrangements not run through Iran's own designated corridor, would only delay reopening and increase tension. Translated out of diplomatic language, that's Iran telling the rest of the world, use our route, pay whatever fees or conditions we attach to it, or expect more of exactly the kind of tanker strikes that have already happened multiple times this year. Now, negotiations. Despite everything above, the diplomatic track hasn't collapsed, which is honestly a little remarkable given the week everyone's just had. Reports indicate talks between the United States and Iran are set to resume in Pakistan around July 11th, once the funeral period concludes. Iran's parliament speaker and chief negotiator has meanwhile been busy elsewhere too, meeting with a senior Houthi official and describing the Memorandum of Understanding with the United States as an achievement for what he called Iran's axis of resistance, arguing the deal effectively forced Washington and Israel to recognize Iran's regional allies as legitimate players. That is a genuinely interesting way to frame a ceasefire agreement that came after your own head of state was killed and your nuclear program was gutted by bunker busters, but it tells you exactly how Tehran intends to sell this entire outcome domestically. Not as a defeat, as proof the axis of resistance survived and came out recognized. There's also a smaller but telling economic detail from the same window. Iran's deputy foreign minister said part of roughly $6 billion in Iranian assets frozen in Qatar would be released, not as direct cash, but in the form of goods, purchased based on Iran's declared needs following talks in Doha. The US has not confirmed this claim independently, but if accurate, it's a small preview of exactly the kind of sanctions relief mechanics both sides are quietly working out, even while the funeral, the assassination chants, and the Hormuz standoff dominate the headlines. And underneath even that, there's a completely separate crisis brewing in Iran's own western provinces that barely anyone outside specialist circles is tracking. Human rights monitoring groups covering Iran's Kurdish regions reported armed clashes around the northwestern cities of Sardasht and Piranshar, with the IRGC allegedly using heavy weaponry near residential areas full of civilians. Outlets close to the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran reported that 5 of the party's members were killed in one of those clashes, near a village close to Piranshar. This is happening at the exact same time Iran is trying to stage a unifying, defiant national funeral for its slain supreme leader. And it's a pointed reminder that the cracks running through this regime didn't pause just because the cameras are currently pointed at Tehran's Grand Mosala. Zoom out and look at everything happening simultaneously right now, because the sheer density of it is the actual story. A regime staging a week-long funeral spectacle for a leader killed by the 2 countries it's currently negotiating with, a named successor who still won't show his own face publicly, even at his own father's burial, reportedly too wounded or too afraid, or both. Crowds at that funeral openly calling for the assassination of a sitting American president, cheered by hundreds of thousands of people, with senior officials publicly promising that Khamenei's killers, whoever the regime believes they are, will not die natural deaths. A missing American sailor, now confirmed lost, after a helicopter crash that officials insist wasn't hostile, but that occurred in exactly the kind of contested waters where that distinction has become genuinely hard to trust at face value. Continued attacks on shipping near Yemen, the Strait of Hormuz, where the actual behavior of commercial vessels contradicts the diplomatic framework everyone claims is holding, fresh armed clashes against Kurdish opposition groups inside Iran's own borders, and a negotiating track that somehow, against everything else happening simultaneously, is still technically scheduled to resume in Pakistan within the week. Every one of these threads on its own would dominate a normal news cycle. Together, they paint a picture of a fragile, wounded state trying to project total unity and defiant strength to its own population and to the world, while visibly struggling to hold its own internal command structure, its own regional shipping lanes, and its own domestic security together at the same time. The question hanging over everything right now is whether talks in Pakistan next week actually produce something durable once the funeral ends, and the cameras move elsewhere, or whether the funeral itself, with its open calls for a president's assassination, its absent supreme leader, and its unresolved undercurrent of vengeance, turns out to be the moment that made any lasting deal impossible in the first place. Watch what comes out of Pakistan on the 11th, watch whether Mojtaba Khamenei ever actually appears in public, and watch the Strait of Hormuz, because commercial ships voting with their own routes are telling you something that no diplomatic statement from either government has been willing to say out loud yet.